As the storm raged outside, I found myself trapped in an unexpected and terrifying situation until a tiny, scrappy puppy appeared out of nowhere, defying all odds to shield me from danger. Little did I know what happened next would completely redefine my understanding of loyalty and miracles. The day had started like any other, with the morning sun casting its warm glow across the sleepy neighborhood. Birds chirped softly outside, and a faint breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. My life was as predictable as the sunrise, a routine that left little room for surprises. My name is Sarah, a 28-year-old graphic designer who spent most of her days working from home. My world revolved around deadlines, coffee cups, and the occasional walk to clear my mind. But that day, the tranquility of my mundane life was about to be shattered in the most extraordinary way. The setting was my small suburban house at the edge of town, a cozy yet unassuming place with white shutters and a front porch adorned with potted plants. The neighborhood was quiet, nestled between rolling fields and a dense forest that stretched endlessly to the horizon. It was the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happened, and that was exactly why I had chosen it. My neighbors were friendly but distant, the kind who waved politely but rarely stopped to chat. That morning, I decided to step out for a quick walk to shake off the monotony. The path I usually took wound through a narrow trail just behind my house, leading into the woods. It was my favorite part of the day, a peaceful escape from the digital chaos of my work. The forest was alive with vibrant greenery, its canopy filtering sunlight into dappled patches on the ground. The air smelled of pine and earth, a scent that always calmed my nerves. As I walked, I noticed something peculiar. A rustling sound came from the bushes nearby. At first, I brushed it off as the wind or perhaps a squirrel scurrying about. But the sound persisted, growing louder and more deliberate. My heart quickened, a mix of curiosity and unease settling over me. I stopped in my tracks and turned toward the noise, peering into the underbrush. That's when I saw him, a small, scruffy puppy with matted fur and eyes that seemed far too wise for his young age. He was no more than a few months old, his tiny frame trembling as he cautiously stepped out of the shadows. His coat was a patchwork of white and brown, though dirt and twigs clung to him like he'd been wandering for days. "Hey there, little guy," I whispered, crouching down to his level. The puppy froze, his wide eyes locking onto mine. There was something hauntingly vulnerable about him, a silent plea for help that tugged at my heartstrings. I extended my hand slowly, not wanting to scare him off. To my surprise, he didn't run. Instead, he inched closer, his movements hesitant but deliberate. As he came closer, I noticed a small wound on his hind leg, a gash that looked painful but not life-threatening. My protective instincts kicked in, and I knew I couldn't just leave him there. "What happened to you?" I murmured, gently stroking his head. The puppy whimpered softly, leaning into my touch as though he hadn't felt kindness in a long time. It was clear he was lost, injured, and desperate for care. I scooped him up carefully, cradling him against my chest as I made my way back home. He didn't resist, his small body limp with exhaustion. As I walked, I couldn't help but wonder where he had come from. Had someone abandoned him? Had he been wandering these woods for days, searching for food and shelter? Back at the house, I set him down on a soft blanket in the living room. He watched me with those soulful eyes as I rummaged through my kitchen for something he could eat. A bowl of water and a piece of leftover chicken seemed to do the trick, and he devoured it with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't eaten in days. Over the next hour, I cleaned his wound as best I could, using a first aid kit I kept under the sink. The puppy didn't flinch, as though he trusted me completely despite having just met me. I decided to name him Max, a strong name for a little fighter. As the day wore on, Max began to relax, curling up on the blanket as if it were the most comfortable place he'd ever been. I couldn't shake the feeling that our meeting wasn't a coincidence. There was something about Max that felt almost fateful, as though he had appeared in my life for a reason. Little did I know, this tiny, injured puppy was about to become the most important part of my life. Max wasn't just a stray looking for a home. He was a guardian, a protector, and a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary bonds come from the most unexpected encounters. The next few days passed by in a blur of caring for Max, and as he grew stronger, I began to notice something unsettling. It wasn't just the obvious signs of him being a stray puppy, his skeletal frame and fearful demeanor, but a deeper sense of unease that began to settle over me. It started small, little things I brushed off at first as coincidence, but as the days wore on, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Max had settled into my life seamlessly. His playful antics brought warmth to my home, his eyes full of trust, his energy a welcome distraction from the sometimes crushing isolation of working alone at home. But his behavior soon began to change, and what once seemed like endearing puppy quirks took on a more concerning tone. Max had always been skittish, jumping at sudden noises and running to hide under the couch whenever anyone approached the door. I thought it was normal, the result of a difficult past. But what unsettled me was the sudden urgency with which he would watch the door or the windows, especially at night. There were moments when I would find him pacing nervously, whining softly, his ears perked up in anticipation of something I couldn't see. One evening, I decided to work late, hoping to catch up on a project deadline. The house was quiet, the soft hum of my laptop the only sound filling the room. Max had been acting strangely for hours, and finally, I decided to sit with him, hoping to reassure him and figure out what was wrong. He was lying in the corner, his body tense, his eyes wide with worry. "Hey, buddy," I whispered, gently patting the spot beside me. Max looked at me, his tail twitching nervously, but he didn't move. It was as if he was staring at something, but there was nothing in the room that could explain his fixation. A chill ran down my spine. Then it happened. A knock at the door. A sound so quiet that I almost wondered if I had imagined it. Max's head snapped up immediately, his entire body rigid with fear. His ears stood on end, and he let out a low growl, an unfamiliar sound coming from deep in his chest. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. The knock came again, slightly louder this time. I slowly stood up, my heart racing as I made my way to the door. I peered through the peephole, half expecting to see no one, maybe just a prankster or a delivery. But there was no one there. I opened the door cautiously, scanning the yard outside, but it was empty. No one in sight. My breath came out in a shaky sigh of relief, but Max wasn't calming down. He was pacing in circles now, frantic, whining louder, and his eyes were fixated on the door as though it would open on its own at any moment. The strange behavior continued over the next few days, growing more intense with each passing hour. Max would bark wildly in the middle of the night, waking me from a deep sleep. His body would tremble with fear, and no amount of soothing would calm him down. It wasn't just the occasional knock on the door. Max had become convinced that something, or someone, was out there, watching us. Then came the night I'll never forget. It was late, and I had just finished working when I heard the unmistakable sound of scratching at the door. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I quickly glanced at Max, who was standing motionless by the door, staring intently at it. The scratching grew louder, more urgent, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I grabbed my phone and checked the camera feed outside my house, praying for some kind of logical explanation. But what I saw made my blood run cold. Standing outside my door was a figure, cloaked in shadow. It was a man, or at least I thought it was. The figure stood motionless, watching the door with unnerving stillness. I backed away from the door, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be happening. I had no idea who this person was, or why they were standing outside in the dark, but I knew one thing for certain. Max wasn't reacting for no reason. Max had been right all along. There was something out there, something that was following us, something I had failed to see. I grabbed my keys, locked the door, and grabbed Max in my arms, my pulse quickening. He was shaking, trembling as though he had been waiting for this moment, and it felt like the walls were closing in around me. I didn't know who the man outside was or why he was there, but I had to protect Max. I had to protect myself. But as I stood there, looking at the empty yard through the window, my heart sank. The figure was gone, disappeared. What did it all mean? What was happening to us? I didn't have the answers, but one thing was certain. Max had sensed something I couldn't yet comprehend. And as the tension in the air grew thicker, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening, it wasn't over. It was just beginning. The following evening felt heavier than any before it. I had tried to go on with my life, pretending everything was normal. But there was no normal anymore, not since the night the mysterious figure appeared outside my door. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that whatever Max had been trying to warn me about, it was far from over. Max was no longer the playful puppy I had welcomed into my home. His body had grown lean and strong, but his eyes were wide with fear. He no longer chased after toys or rolled around on the grass. Instead, he stayed close to me, his presence a constant reminder that something was out there, waiting. That night, I decided to get to the bottom of it. I couldn't continue to live in fear. unsure of who was lurking in the shadows. It wasn't just the figure that unnerved me. It was the way Max had reacted, his growls, his warnings, the way he paced and stared at the door as if he could see something I couldn't. I needed answers. I sat on the couch, the familiar hum of the television filling the silence in the room. Max lay by my side, his head resting on my lap. But tonight something was different. The tension in the air was palpable. The usual sounds of the neighborhood, the distant chatter of neighbors, the occasional car passing by had disappeared. The night was eerily still. Max suddenly stirred, lifting his head. His body tensed, his ears perked up, and his eyes darted toward the door. I held my breath, my pulse quickening as I realized what was happening. It was happening again. The scratching at the door came, sharp and distinct. But this time, it wasn't a gentle tap. It was insistent, deliberate. There was a force behind it, a sense of urgency that I had never felt before. Max growled low in his throat, his body trembling with anxiety. I tried to calm him, whispering soothing words as I approached the door. But something told me not to open it. Not yet. I reached for my phone and opened the camera feed once more. My hands were shaking, my heart racing in anticipation. What I saw made my blood run cold. The figure was back. He was standing just beyond the porch, his back turned toward me, but this time I could see him more clearly. He was tall, his form silhouetted against the dim light from the street lamp. His face was hidden, obscured by the shadows, but the eerie stillness of his presence was unmistakable. It was as if he was waiting for something, waiting for me. But what shook me to the core was the way Max reacted. His growl turned into a full-on bark, his eyes locked on the door, his body rigid with fear. This wasn't just a warning anymore. This was desperation. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. Who was this person? And why did Max seem to know something I didn't? The scratching intensified, becoming louder, more frantic. I couldn't ignore it any longer. With Max at my side, I decided to confront the figure. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I knew I couldn't hide forever. I stepped cautiously to the door and opened it just enough to peek outside. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the yard, my eyes searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. The figure was gone. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I found in the yard. At first, I thought I was imagining things. But as I stepped onto the porch, I saw it clearly, a trail of strange, deep marks leading from the edge of the yard to the porch itself. They weren't just scratches, they were gouges, deep enough to leave a lasting impression in the dirt. They were fresh, as if something had dragged itself along the ground, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. I knelt down, my heart pounding in my chest, and ran my fingers along the marks. They felt cold to the touch, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. This was no ordinary animal. Whatever had been outside my door was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. Max barked furiously, pulling at his leash, trying to get closer to the marks. It was as if he knew something I didn't, something that I wasn't ready to understand. I couldn't deny the truth any longer. Whatever had been haunting us wasn't just a random figure. It was something far more sinister. The scratching continued, but this time I didn't have to open the door. I already knew what was happening. The figure wasn't trying to get in. It was trying to lure me out. A sudden, terrifying realization struck me like a bolt of lightning. The figure wasn't just waiting for me. It was waiting for Max. The intensity of the scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if it had become desperate. Max stood at the door, barking furiously, trying to get to whatever was on the other side. I held him back, my arms trembling with fear, knowing that if I opened the door now, it could be too late. But it was too late to stop. Max's instincts had been right all along. Whatever was out there was ready to strike. It wasn't just a random person or an animal. It was something more. I couldn't let Max face it alone. And I couldn't let this unknown terror destroy the life we had started to build together. Whatever came next, I knew we had to face it head-on. As the intensity of the situation mounted, I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Max's relentless barking only heightened the tension, sending chills down my spine. I knew I had to act quickly. It wasn't just my life that was at stake anymore. It was Max's too. Whatever force was behind the mysterious figure at the door had already proven its power. But I couldn't let it control us any longer. I glanced at Max, whose eyes were now wild with a mixture of fear and determination. He was no longer the playful, carefree puppy I had adopted months ago. He was alert, protective, and ready to do whatever it took to keep me safe. His loyalty and courage had been tested in ways I had never imagined. Yet I knew that if we were going to face whatever was out there, we had to stick together. I took a deep breath and looked back at the marks on the ground, the deep gouges that seemed to tell a story of their own. They were fresh, as if whatever had made them had only just passed through. I followed the trail cautiously, every step filled with the weight of uncertainty. Max was by my side, still barking fiercely, but his tone was different now, urgent and pleading. He knew that we were on the verge of something far greater than either of us had anticipated. As I moved closer to the marks, I could feel the air grow colder, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The darkness of the night seemed to press in around us, making everything feel claustrophobic. I felt like I was being watched, like eyes were following every movement I made. But when I looked around, I saw nothing, only the eerie silence of the empty yard and the dim glow of the streetlights in the distance. The quiet seemed unnatural, as though the world had gone still, holding its breath in anticipation. I knelt down again, studying the trail. The marks were deep, almost as if something large and powerful had dragged itself across the yard. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I was starting to piece together a terrifying picture in my mind, one that I couldn't quite fully comprehend. But I had no time to dwell on it. Max was still barking, his voice growing more frantic with each passing second. The urgency in his tone was unmistakable. He was warning me. I stood up quickly and turned back toward the house, making sure to keep Max close. The scratching at the door had stopped, but the atmosphere was heavy with the feeling of something lurking just beyond the threshold. I tried to steady my breathing, my heart pounding in my chest. It felt like the calm before the storm. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A low, guttural growl, distant but unmistakable. It sent a jolt of panic through me. Max froze, his ears pinned back, his body tense. The growl seemed to reverberate through the air, almost like a warning. My pulse quickened, and I realized with growing horror that whatever was out there was not just a threat, it was hunting us. Without thinking, I grabbed Max's leash and tugged him toward the house. My mind was racing, calculating the best course of action, but I couldn't come up with anything. We couldn't stay here. We couldn't hide forever. But I had no idea what we were facing. What had been watching us? What had Max been trying to warn me about? I fumbled for my phone, desperately dialing the number of a trusted friend who lived nearby. I needed help, but I knew that whatever was out there might be too dangerous to confront alone. The phone rang endlessly, but no one picked up. I cursed under my breath. The silence around me was suffocating, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. Max's ears perked up once more, and he tugged at the leash, pulling me toward the backyard. I hesitated for a moment, my heart racing, but then I followed. Something told me that if we were going to survive, we needed to face whatever this was head-on. There was no turning back now. I reached the back door and glanced outside into the darkness. The faint glow from the porch light did little to cut through the night's thick shadows. But then I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness. They were piercing and full of malice, fixed directly on me. My breath caught in my throat. It was as if the figure had been waiting for me to make the next move. Max growled low in his throat, his muscles tense, ready to spring into action. I could feel his protective instinct surging, and I knew we had to move fast. I flung open the back door and stepped outside, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure didn't move. It stood still, as if it were waiting for something. The glow from the streetlight revealed a tall, imposing figure, but its features were still hidden in shadow. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. What was this thing? And why had it been watching us? Max barked furiously, his growls becoming more intense. The figure didn't flinch. It remained eerily still, its eyes locked on mine. The silence between us seemed to stretch out forever, broken only by Max's barks and my shallow breathing. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure moved. It stepped back into the shadows, disappearing from sight. But the danger wasn't over. I could still feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edge of the yard. Max's growls faded as I pulled him back inside, slamming the door behind us. I collapsed against the door, my heart still racing in my chest. What had just happened? Had we narrowly escaped some kind of danger? Or had we just triggered something far worse? I didn't know the answers, but one thing was certain. Whatever had been watching us, whatever had been following us, wasn't done yet. And now it was personal. Max lay at my feet, exhausted but alert, his eyes still darting around the room. We were safe for now. But I knew that safety was fleeting. Whatever came next, we would face it together. There was no running from this. We had to fight for our survival, no matter what it took. The air was thick with unease as I sat in the safety of my house, my eyes darting nervously from window to window. The feeling that something was just beyond the threshold, watching and waiting, hadn't faded. Max, my loyal dog, was restless, pacing back and forth, his ears perked and nose twitching. His instinct had never been wrong before, and the way he was acting now told me everything I needed to know. Something was out there, something we had no understanding of, and I was about to face it head-on. I couldn't shake the thought that it wasn't over. The figure that had stood at the edge of the yard, its glowing eyes seared into my memory, its presence so heavy it almost felt physical. Even after it disappeared into the shadows, I felt like it was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I had no idea who or what it was, but one thing was certain. It wasn't human, and it wasn't going to leave us alone. Max whined softly, his unease growing with each passing second. He had always been my protector, the one who kept me safe from anything that might threaten us. But even he could sense that whatever we were dealing with now was unlike anything we had faced before. It wasn't just some neighborhood troublemaker or an animal in the woods. This was something far more sinister. I tried to rationalize the situation, telling myself it was just a strange person or perhaps even a wild animal. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The events of the night, the growls, the glowing eyes, the silence, spoke to something far darker, something more dangerous. My instincts were screaming at me that we were not safe here. I stood up, pacing the living room, trying to think of what to do next. My phone was still on the table, and I reached for it, hoping to find a solution, a way out. I called my friend again, hoping this time they would answer, but again, no luck. My heart sank. No one was coming. It was just Max and me against whatever this was. I couldn't rely on anyone else. I had to protect us. Max stopped pacing and sat down, staring intently at the back door. His body was tense, every muscle ready to spring into action. I followed his gaze, my pulse quickening as I stared at the door, half expecting the figure from before to appear again. But nothing happened. The stillness of the night was almost unbearable. It was as though the entire world had stopped moving, waiting for the next move. Suddenly, Max's body stiffened, his ears shooting up. A low growl rumbled in his chest, the sound vibrating through the room like an echo of danger. He had sensed something. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it too. Something was coming. It was getting closer, and it wasn't going to stop until it had whatever it was after. I grabbed Max's leash again, the decision forming in my mind. I couldn't wait around anymore. The silence was deafening, and every passing moment felt like a countdown to something worse. I had to take action. I had to find out what was going on, and I had to do it before it was too late. I opened the back door cautiously, stepping out into the yard with Max by my side. The night air was cold, and a chill ran down my spine as I scanned the surroundings. The shadows were long, stretching across the yard like dark tendrils, but there was no sign of the figure. No glowing eyes. No sound. Just an unsettling stillness. Max growled again, this time more intensely, his hackles raised. He was alert, ready for whatever came next. And then I heard it, the faint rustling in the bushes, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just the wind or an animal. This was something else. I turned to Max, my hand on his collar, and whispered, "Stay close." We crept forward, making our way toward the source of the sound. I knew we couldn't wait any longer. Whatever had been watching us before was back, and this time it was closer than ever. The rustling grew louder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We weren't alone. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form obscured by darkness, but I could still see the glowing eyes, glowing faintly like the embers of a dying fire. My breath caught in my throat, and Max's growl turned into a full-blown bark. The figure didn't move, but it didn't need to. It was clear that whatever this was, it wasn't going to back down. I backed away slowly, keeping Max close, but the figure didn't follow. Instead, it stood still, as if it were observing us. A chill swept over me, and I realized that whatever this thing was, it wasn't just here to scare us, it was here for something else. But what? What did it want with us? Max's bark grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel his fear and determination radiating from him. He was trying to protect me, but I could tell that even he didn't fully understand what we were up against. The figure remained silent, unmoving, its eyes fixed on me as if waiting for me to make the next move. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. Should I run? Should I fight? What was this creature, and what did it want? I had no answers, only questions that seemed to multiply with every passing second. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared back into the shadows, vanishing from sight. I stood there frozen, my mind reeling, unable to comprehend what had just happened. But I knew one thing for sure: the danger wasn't over. Whatever that creature was, it was still out there, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Max was still growling, his body tense, his eyes scanning the darkness. I could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on me. We weren't just dealing with something mysterious, we were facing an entity far more dangerous, something that had the power to control the night itself. I took a step back, my pulse still racing, knowing that we had to prepare for whatever was coming next. The conflict wasn't over, it had only just begun. And I wasn't sure we were ready for what would happen next, but I knew we had no choice but to face it. Together. As the days passed after the terrifying encounter in the yard, the sense of unease that had settled over our home lingered. Max and I were no longer the same. He was more cautious, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows, his ears twitching at every creak of the house or rustle in the trees. He was on high alert, and I couldn't blame him. We had both felt the presence of something darker, something that had been watching us, waiting for its moment to strike. The figure that had appeared in the yard, the glowing eyes, the menacing stillness, had left a lasting impression on both of us. I had tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild, that the fear I had felt was exaggerated by the isolation of the night. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that what I had seen was real, and whatever it was still out there. The danger was not over. It was only just beginning. In the following days, I became more and more determined to find answers. I couldn't let myself live in fear, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering when the next attack would come. Max needed me to be strong, to keep him safe, and I couldn't do that if I let the fear control me. I had to face whatever it was that had invaded our home, no matter how terrifying it seemed. I started by researching. I spent hours online, poring over articles and forums about strange occurrences and paranormal encounters. I read about people who had experienced similar things, mysterious figures, glowing eyes, a sense of being watched, and while their stories were chilling, they didn't provide the answers I was looking for. There were no concrete explanations, no definitive answers, just more questions. But one thing stood out to me, a pattern. Over and over again, people described the same experiences, the same sense of dread, the same feeling of being pursued, the same strange, otherworldly presence that seemed to be just out of reach. It was as though this thing, whatever it was, had been hunting people for years, striking in the shadows, always just out of sight but never truly gone. Max, for his part, was becoming more withdrawn. He no longer greeted strangers with his usual exuberance, and his behavior was erratic. He would bark at nothing, growl at empty corners, and stare out the windows as if waiting for something to appear. It was as though he could sense the danger even more clearly than I could, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to take action. One afternoon, I decided to confront the fear head-on. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and Max by my side, I ventured out into the yard. I needed to understand what was going on. I needed to know if I was truly dealing with something paranormal, or if I had let my imagination get the best of me. The sun was beginning to set as we stepped outside, and the familiar shadows of the yard stretched long across the grass. Max walked beside me, his body tense, his eyes darting from side to side. He was on edge, but he trusted me. I could feel it in the way he stayed close to my side, never straying too far. I moved slowly, scanning the yard, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with tension, every rustle of leaves, every creak of the trees making my heart race. It was as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. 4 hours, we searched the yard, the woods beyond, the fences, every nook and cranny. But there was nothing. No glowing eyes, no figure watching us from the shadows. Just the usual sounds of the night. Crickets, wind rustling through the trees, the occasional bark from a dog down the road. I couldn't explain it. Had it been a trick of the mind? Had I imagined the whole thing? I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. On the one hand, I was grateful that nothing had appeared. But on the other hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. Watching, waiting, biding its time. The next day, I decided to take a different approach. I reached out to a local paranormal investigator. I had read about their work online, and their website had detailed accounts of strange occurrences in the area. Maybe they would have the answers I was looking for. To my surprise, they responded almost immediately. A man named David, who had been investigating paranormal phenomena for over a decade, agreed to meet with me. He explained that many people in the area had reported similar experiences, strange lights, unexplainable sounds, and sightings of figures that seemed to vanish when approached. David was calm and professional, his presence reassuring as he toured the yard, taking notes and examining the area. Max, as always, was on edge, growling at unseen forces. David listened carefully to my account of the events, nodding as if he had heard this story countless times before. "It's not uncommon," he said. "These things, whatever they are, seem to appear and disappear without warning. But the fact that it's been happening here for some time, that's concerning." He suggested setting up a series of cameras around the property to capture any strange activity. We spent the next few hours placing cameras in the areas where Max had shown the most anxiety, making sure they were well hidden, but still able to capture the view of the yard. As the sun set and the cameras began recording, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I wasn't alone anymore. I had help, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was taking control of the situation. The cameras were rolling, and whatever it was that had been haunting us, it would no longer be able to move undetected. That night, Max and I sat on the porch, waiting. The yard was silent, and for the first time in days, I felt a sense of peace. But in the back of my mind, I knew this was only the beginning. The creature, the presence, was still out there, and I wasn't going to stop until I understood it, until I knew exactly what it wanted and why it had targeted us. As the hours passed, the cameras captured nothing out of the ordinary. No figures, no glowing eyes, no strange noises. It was as if the darkness itself had swallowed the night, leaving only silence in its wake. And for the first time in days, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we were safe. But as the days passed and the cameras continued to roll, we would soon discover that the true nature of the threat was far deeper than we had ever imagined. This wasn't just a random encounter. It was something more, something older, and its presence in our lives had only just begun. And no matter how hard we tried to escape it, we would never be able to outrun it forever. After all the long nights, countless hours of investigation, and mounting tension, we were no closer to understanding the force that had been lurking just outside our doors. But now I had the undeniable truth. There was something in this world that we couldn't explain, something that operated outside the boundaries of logic and reason. And no matter how hard we tried to rationalize it, the strange presence remained, haunting us with each passing day. In the days that followed David's visit, we continued with our preparations. The cameras recorded, the nights stretched long, and still there was no sign of the mysterious presence. Every day, I told myself that the danger had passed. Maybe it was just an illusion, a passing moment that I had misinterpreted. Yet deep in my gut, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. And then, one night, I received the call. It was David. His voice was serious, more somber than I had ever heard it. "Check the footage," he said simply, before hanging up. My heart raced as I immediately sat down to go through the video feeds. What I saw on the screen made my stomach drop. In the footage, Max and I were clearly visible, but something else, something faint, barely noticeable, was also in the corner of the frame. A shadow, a flicker, as if someone or something was standing just beyond the light of the porch, hidden in the darkness. I leaned forward, staring at the screen. There it was again, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. The glowing eyes. And then it was gone. In the blink of an eye, it vanished as if it had never been there. I couldn't believe it. We had been watched the entire time, unknowingly filmed by a presence that was out of our sight but not out of reach. My mind raced as I tried to piece everything together. I replayed the footage over and over again, hoping for some kind of rational explanation. But there was none. What I had seen, what I had felt, was real. I immediately called David back. "What does this mean?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. "How do we stop this? How do we make it go away?" David's response was grave. "This isn't something you can simply remove. This entity, this force, is a part of your life now. It's been drawn to you for reasons we don't yet understand. You need to take steps to protect yourself. There are ways to shield your home, your energy. But it won't be easy, and you can't do it alone." His words hit me like a brick. There was no escape, no simple solution. The presence, whatever it was, had marked us. Max and I were now part of its strange world, and we would have to find a way to coexist, or face whatever consequences came from not doing so. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't wait any longer, couldn't keep living in fear, not knowing what might happen next. I reached out to David again, this time with a plan in mind. We needed to go deeper, uncover more, and confront whatever this was head-on. We couldn't keep running. The next few days were spent preparing for the ritual. The team David had brought together, experts in the occult and paranormal, arrived, each person with their own set of tools and methods. It wasn't easy, and I couldn't fully understand everything they were doing, but I knew that they were doing everything in their power to protect us. They set up candles, chalked symbols on the ground, and spoke in languages I couldn't comprehend. It felt like something out of a movie, something I had never expected to be a part of. Max and I stood in the middle of it all, watching as the ritual began. The air was thick with tension, a quiet hum of energy that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I held Max close, whispering to him, telling him that we would get through this together. The sound of chanting filled the room, the flicker of candles casting long shadows on the walls. And then it happened. There was a flash, a loud crack, like thunder splitting the sky. The room seemed to grow cold, as though the very air itself had turned against us. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the silence returned. A calm settled over the house. The experts exchanged looks, their faces pale. David turned to me, his eyes wide with a mixture of relief and fear. "It's done," he said quietly. For a long moment, there was only silence. No glowing eyes, no shadows. The presence was gone, or at least it seemed to be. Max looked up at me, his tail wagging cautiously, as though he, too, was unsure of what had just occurred. We had faced the darkness together, and for now, at least, we were safe. But as the days passed, I found myself reflecting on what we had been through. What had it all meant? Why had this thing targeted us, and what had it wanted? Were we simply caught in a web of forces we could never fully understand? Or had we just been in the wrong place at the wrong time? I didn't have all the answers, and I might never get them. But what I did know was this: Max had saved me. Not just from the danger we faced, but from the fear that had gripped me for so long. He had been my protector, my constant companion through it all, and no matter what happened next, we would face it together. If you've ever been through something like this, something that shakes you to your core and makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world, then you understand the impact it has. It changes you, but it also teaches you about strength, about trust, and about the unbreakable bond that can form between a person and their dog. Max was more than just a pet. He was family, and together we had survived the unimaginable. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything that has happened, I can't help but feel a sense of gratitude. We made it through the darkness, and we've come out stronger on the other side. But this isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning. If you've enjoyed hearing our story and want to know more about our journey, subscribe and follow along. Together, we'll face whatever comes next and share the lessons we've learned along the way. Because when you have a bond as strong as ours, there's no force in the world that can break it.